Hello, in this lecture section, we're going to be talking about eugenics. And eugenics, I'd like to point out, go back prior to the 1890s, but it hits a height in the 1920s. Eugenics was seen as with the understanding we have all this new science and that we could actually control the undesirable population. Eugenics not only resulted in mass sterilizations of a population, but it also was showed banner of anti-immigrant, anti-African American, anti what we call now is the LGBTQIA plus movement. So pretty at the time it was viewed as homosexuals. It was against poor people, unmarried mothers, the disabled, and mentally ill. And it was federally, they created programs of federally funded sterilization that was prominent in over 32 states in the 20th century. And it promoted, it had a lot of misguided things. The early eugenics at this period isn't just about sterilization, it is also about propaganda. It was believed that there were people who were lesser than that you could breed out the hereditary traits that promoted poverty and that promoted mental illness, that promoted removed criminality. And so in this period, you actually have a rush of people doing their genealogy, and they would create this genealogical certificate that showed they were genealogically pure. It was believed by a lot of people who were eugenicists as that if someone was a criminal in your past or was mentally ill in your past, that it was genetically could be associated with that. And if you had one person in, the next generation would be more likely to be criminals, and then the next and the next until it ran out your line, your heritage line. So it was this belief of having this pure human line that happens out of this. Eugenics actually is noticed by Adolf Hitler, and he actually adopts this in Germany. Once he becomes a counselor, he ends up passing different Nuremberg laws as well as other laws that end up resulting in the Holocaust. It is not Germany that comes up with this. The United States is the proponent of eugenics. There were prominent eugenicists around, such as Helen Keller was a prominent eugenicist. You had Charles Lindbergh. You had the famous pilot. You had a lot of people that probably should have known better in many ways. That the understanding of not only birth control and sterilization, as well as almost promoting that we should remove the populace from this. The eugenics of the 20th century crossed all borders, from medical superintendents to legislators to social reformers. And it became such a movement that that sterilization laws were put on the book. Sterilization was the understanding that we could remove hereditary traits from this by forced conditions, and the hereditary complaints that most of this was criminality, feeble-mindedness, and sexual deviance. Sterilization advocates viewed reproductive surgery as a necessary public health intervention that protected society from deteriorated stock. For example of that is it's pretty much saying that if you're going to sterilize someone, you're going to say that not to them directly, often that their progeny are unsuitable and weird, unsuitable and assimilable, and we don't want to deal with that. For an example, At the beginning of 1909 and continuing for 70 years, California had led the number of sterilization procedures and performed on men and women. And these are known as the Asexualization Acts. Often, they were done without the full knowledge or consent of the patient. There were over 20,000 sterilizations that took place in state institutions and comprised of 1/3 of the performed in 32 states. An example of this is Adolf Hitler wrote about California having read some of the sterilization acts. It says, quote, "This is today one state in which at least weak beginnings towards a better conception of citizenship are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States." End quote. It was partially driven by the anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Mexican prejudice that's going on, as well as some Native American issues that happened. Native Americans were sterilized. You also have sterilization, particularly in the South, of African Americans, and most of the people who go under sterilization do not know that it was going to happen. Example, southern states called employed sterilization means known as the Mississippi appendectomies. So it was known as the Mississippi appendectomies. And really what they would say is, oh, you need an appendectomy, and go in and do an unnecessary hysterectomy or bilateral tube ligation, which is where you cut the tubes. It's more complicated than that, but it prevents women from doing this, as well as vasectomies. And this happened mainly at teaching schools. The Tuskegee Institute performed many of these, and they were done on women of color, and it was for medical school practice. 1/3 of the sterilization on girls were done on girls who were under the age of 18 and as young as 9. The states also targeted delinquent or unwholesome people. And there are archives of this. And just to understand, this not only persists through the 1920s, it has its height in the 1920s. But it goes from 1970 to 1980. All the way to the 1980s, where women were receiving these bilateral tubal ligations or full hysterectomies while they thought they were getting their appendix removed. I'm going to talk about some landmark cases, and then we'll talk about other aspects of eugenics. So some of the landmark cases with regards to eugenics sterilization is Buck versus Bell. And this happens in 1927. So Carrie Buck is a poor white woman who is the first person to be sterilized in Virginia. And what happens is that she is young. She gets pregnant due to a rape from her cousin. And she is adopted. And so her adoptive parents... She gets pregnant due to rape. She ends up giving birth. Her adopted parents end up taking away her baby, and then after the birth, she is institutionalized, which means that she's put into an insane asylum for being feeble-minded and promiscuous. And they thought, well, she can't have any more kids because she's going to pass on those traits. So they end up sterilizing her, and it was repealed it was brought to the Supreme Court, and it was an 8-1 decision that the Supreme Court found that the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924 did not violate the United States Constitution. So Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said in reference, quote, "We have seen more than once the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if I could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the United States for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world, If instead of waiting to execute degenerative offspring for crime or let starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifesting unfit for their continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover the fallopian tubes. The 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. End quote. So in that, he's saying that, we just need to get rid of these people. I'm tired of seeing this. They are the dregs of society, and to do this, we should sterilize. Another example, this is a later example, but I'm bringing this up now because we won't get to talk about eugenics any other time, is Rolf V. Weinberger of 1973. And this is a case between 2 African American sisters from Alabama named Mary Alice and Minnie Rolfe. And they are sterilized at the ages of 14 and 12. And their mother, and this goes about, they're actually the youngest of 6 kids from a very poor family. And their mother was illiterate, and so was their father. And while the father was away, the mother, someone came to their house and asked. They said, "Look, they're coming of age. You need to have the birth control shot that will help, so that these girls won't have children too young." And so the mom agreed, thinking that their kids were going to get a shot, signed on a piece of paper of an X, went in the hospital, and they went in the hospital, and both had hysterectomies. And the father was confused at why they couldn't bring their kids home, and he noticed scars on it. Now, it's important to note one of these kids were mentally handicapped. Both were mentally handicapped, and they end up in 1974. The Southern Poverty Law Center ends up filing a lawsuit on their behalf, and out of this comes a really startling realization for a lot of people that between 100,000 and 150,000 poor people were being sterilized each year by federally funded programs, and this ends up. They end up passing in 2015 the Eugenics Compensation Act, which the Senate voted unanimously to help surviving victims of forced sterilization. And North Carolina paid $35,000 to 220 survivors per person, and Virginia agreed to pay $25,000 per survivor. Now, it's important to note with both Carrie Buck and the Ralph children, that often they did not know what was happening. In fact, not only Carrie Buck was sterilized, but her sister was also sterilized. And her sister didn't realize that she was sterilized until 1980. She kept trying to have kids, and it never happened. And almost to her end of her life, she dies a few years later, that she finds out that she had been sterilized. This was a very common thing. This was instituted, that not only sterilization happens, but experiments were happening on people as well. This is a small aspect of eugenics. Eugenics is much broader. The eugenics movement right now is on the rise again, and we see this on a lot of people who are running for political office are kind of proponing the same kind of eugenics understanding. This is it is extremely harmful. In the 1920s, you have things like eugenics fairs, where people travel around the United States, and they'll have like a flashing light at these fairs, and they say every time the light flashes, every 10 seconds, a mentally retarded child is born, or a criminal is being born, and we need to stop this, and it is our job. You get an entire study that deals with like the head size of people, and they would show these images in regards to eugenics of these are normal facial structures, and then this is how you can tell if someone's a criminal, or this is how you can tell these various things. So they would take pictures of people. A big proponent, also there's a poster that day and age that came out in the 20s, as well as it was used in the 60s, of this poster of these babies sitting in a row, and it says, which baby is the bad baby? And most people pointed to the African American baby and said, that's a bad baby. That's, of course, ridiculous, because they were just infants sitting down. But this was still a proponent. There was a study done I think in the last 10 years, where people were then asked again, which baby is the bad baby? And just by the facial pictures, this is profiling to the extreme. Not only did sanitation laws get passed, for example, Idaho passes a sanitation law on the guys, sterilization law on the guys, that they are going to stop homosexual men from reproducing, so they're going to sterilize them. So it's not just sterilization. You have a lot of hate things that happens. Helen Keller, who was both blind and deaf, came, it was a great coup for the eugenicists that she came out and said, look, we should not have people who are blind and deaf. She goes around and talks about how she is the exception to the rule, but for the most part it is just too painful and we shouldn't have it. It is better mercy to have the kids die young. There were people who also went to these different fairs and said, if you had a child who was mentally disabled, if you smothered them in their sleep, maybe it wouldn't be as bad. You have people who firmly are... There was a hierarchy even of different racial makeups and how they ranked in this, of how they're going to be criminals and whatnot, or what is the good race, what is the good... person. It is not just white people who are doing this. Again, the KKK gets on board, but you also have people from other races as well getting on board with this. And it's not just races. Most of the people came out against women at this time. If you were in an insane asylum, and you could be put in an insane asylum by being too sexually promiscuous, by having your husband beat you and you come out against him, by wanting a divorce, you could be institutionalized during this time. As we talked about last week with Alice Paul, who does the hunger strike, she is institutionalized for that. If you were in an institution, often you were sterilized, or you were seen as, okay, we need to get rid of this, you are subhuman. And this is the whole thing, is the ranking of human genetics. Adolf Hitler and other nations that were proponent against genocide end up taking eugenics and using them. Today in the United States, there is a larger rise in eugenics, as well as neo-Nazism, as the alt-right and stuff, of people wanting to go, that are saying that in fact there is, we can breed out the different heritage, we can breed out all these flaws in humanities. We'll use Darwin and change it so that science can make us better as a populace, and so we won't have people who are deemed inferior. For example, this Iceland just recently passed, where they are banning all pregnancies with Down syndrome, and that they have said, look, we have fixed Down syndrome in the United States, in Iceland, which, regardless of your belief on that, it is kind of, wait a minute, this is a form of eugenics. So just understand the 1920s is kind of the catalyst that sets up the Holocaust in the United States. So I hope you learned, were enlightened by what eugenics were, and also some of the sterilization. Oh, before that, sorry, I have to talk about birth control in regards to this. It was seen that with more birth control that we could help do eugenics. So even like Margaret Sanger ended up being accused of being a eugenicist. I'm not quite sure if that's the case, but with the ACA we can. It's important to note that with women's bodies and subsequent with the advent of increasingly better birth control, that some eugenicists use this as a movement of anti-eugenics. It's really interesting in the fact that women were seen as they shouldn't use birth control, but these mass sterilizations are happening. The fact that they even last into the 80s is indicative of how controversial not only of reproductive rights are in the United States, and these are most often used against women, but they were also used against criminals in different prison systems, as well as against the LGBTQIA plus members or people as well. So I hope you found eugenics enlightening.